Hello there everyone and welcome to our YouTube channel. My name is Savvy from We Art Wolf, and today I'm going to be showing you how I worked on the sculpt of Dr. Esther Mahlangu, a South African Ndebele artist. In this video you will see me starting off from a really basic mesh, then constructing the shapes of her face, then going up in detail to the final sculpt. So right at the start, you would want to get as much reference images of the character as possible. So you want to get different angles of the person's face, try to get images of the front view, side view, and so on. So the software that I normally use for viewing these reference images is called PureRef. It's a really great software. You can take your reference images from wherever and you can put them into PureRef. And what I normally do is I enable the always on top mode, so I don't need a second computer or I don't have to always alt tab to view my images, so it's always overlaying my work. So I started this project using the basic default head from the ZBrush libraries as my starting point. You don't have to start like this, but I usually do when I want to just make things easier right at the beginning. You can start off with your own personalized blockout if you want to. So I usually start by getting the basic details of a character's face. I'll later come back and revisit these features now and then, but that's usually what you want to do. Also, you should probably always do it at a lower resolution. It doesn't have to be that low. It just needs to be at a level where you can have as much control as possible, where you can morph or change the shape of the character without having to struggle with a higher resolution. So right now, literally just carving out the features that stand out most, like the nose, her mouth, the shape of her chin and her head. The ears will come in a little later, but right now it's just the eyes, the nose and the mouth and the shape of her head. So for this sculpt, I didn't want her to have a neutral look on her face. I wanted her to have some sort of expression, so I ended up going for a normal smile. I will later add more detail to the mouth and whatnot, but I just sculpted a basic form of what she would look like if she was actually smiling. So just stretching out the lips a little more and then coming back and adding in a lot more detail later. What you will normally see me do in some of my videos and future videos that I will be working on is early on I like to get the eyes already done, not complete, but the basic forms and basic shapes. I'll fill in the eye socket with a sphere or just actually sculpt in an eye myself. But I usually do this so that it helps me get an idea of what the face would look like in the end. Helps with expressions as well. Sometimes I don't just end at the eyes, I also come in and add in details in the eyebrows. This is because eyes and eyebrows add in so much information and so much detail to a person's face. Take for example, if you had to look at someone without eyebrows, you kind of notice it very quickly. So eyebrows add in a lot more depth and a lot more information to a person's face, and I just like to get those parts done early on. Also the nose, sometimes I'll just block out the nose and see how it plays with the person's face, and if it works out, then I'll just stick to that form. If it doesn't, then I'll change it as many times, but usually at this point of the sculpt I'll change as much details as possible, and I'll come back later with so much more detail with a higher resolution. With the color of the eyes, I wanted to show that she's getting old, and with the old eyes they tend to glow a little blurry, and you can see that this person is losing some sight. So if you can see with her eyes, she has a tint of blue and a little bit of gray, and I just wanted to show that early on. Having a sphere inside the eye socket to represent the eye also helps with the shape of the eyelids. So it helps me figure out, okay, how do the eyelids rest on the eye and how will they wrap around it. I added her neck jewelry very early because it helps me understand how her neck is formed. So with these rings in most cultures, what they do is they tend to stretch the person's neck a little bit, and their neck will rest at a certain angle. So I added these rings very early to understand how her neck and her overall shape would look. So without the necklaces, I imagine her neck is quite long and really skinny. Usually what I've seen with these cultures who wear these rings around their neck, their necks have morphed. They've kind of changed in shape and size. So I imagine that this is the situation for her as well. The blanket wrapped around her is really simple in shape. There isn't much that I can add to this besides like fuzz and fur and anything, but I didn't add any of that for this sculpt. I just made it look like it's a blanket wrapped around her. Also, this is something that you have to include because it's a part of the culture. So this isn't something I could ignore. But the overall shape of the blanket was really simple because there isn't much features. She isn't moving her hand around and anything like that. So the shape of the blanket is really simple. Ears are usually a hassle to work on, especially when you're a beginner. You just started 3D sculpting or doing 3D art in general. Ears are normally a hassle. Sometimes it's not just when you're a beginner, even when you've been doing it for years and whatever. Ears are normally really irritating to work on if you don't understand the basic shapes and how it's formed. You can do like a complete copy of a sculpt or your reference images, but if you don't understand how ears usually work, then you will normally make a lot of mistakes. I personally also don't feel like I completely mastered ears, but I do understand how ears work and I do understand how they're supposed to look. So now we're going into the more detailed aspect of the mesh. So going up in resolution, adding in more subdivision levels so that we'll be able to sculpt finer details such as veins, pimples, and all that you wouldn't get at a lower resolution. And I will show you how I add in wrinkles and skin details and pores and everything. So what I like to do, the way I handle details, skin details for my characters, with either the damp standard or your standard brush, I tend to use the damp standard. You can either have a dedicated brush for skin details, but I normally use the default brushes given to me in ZBrush. Make sure that your mesh has a high enough resolution, otherwise the details won't really work in a low resolution, and sometimes your mesh will just crumble. So with the damp standard brush selected, I tend to change the brush alpha, your default brush alpha, to the ones with dots, your alpha 31 in ZBrush or your alpha 32. Then you change your stroke from dots to either drag rect. People tend to use drag normally because it's much easier to handle, especially with a large mesh or a large character. You would normally want to handle the skin very quickly. But sometimes you can also use the color spray. You can also use your normal spray. I don't think there's much of a difference. And you just keep on brushing over this mesh until you get something that looks like skin. That's the way that I usually add skin details to my characters. So it's really easy, but sometimes it gets really tedious. Sometimes people come to the surface modifier and you just add in a noise. You activate the surface noise, and then you just add in noise to your character automatically. But I tend to do it by hand because I have a lot more control. Wrinkles kind of work just the same. So what you're going to do is you're going to change your alpha from your dots, and you're going to come to alpha 60, and then you just kind of add wrinkles as you go along. So they're not going to be that intense. You don't want them to be that heavy or that intense. But normally you just have your intensity set to 5 or 4, and then you just keep on brushing along. Then you toggle back and forth between your clay spray and your dots. And then you can just add a more stable version of like the wrinkles and whatnot. But that's how I usually handle wrinkles and skin. When handling really thin lines like wrinkles, Damp Standard usually does it for me. There are other brushes that you can probably get the same effect, but for me, Damp Standard is normally the brush that I use when it comes to getting those really thin lines. Sometimes I tend to have the brush size set to high, so I can get like a nice dip within the mesh. So the brush size, I just set it to high, and then I decrease the intensity so it doesn't really break the mesh that much. But normally when I'm handling wrinkles, Damp Standard is the one that I use mostly. It's also important to note that not everything you put on the face is random. So your wrinkles have a specific direction that they flow in. So just remember that you're not just going to come in with your Damp Standard brush and then randomly put wrinkles everywhere. Because eventually it'll start looking like they're just cross-hatching, but they have a specific direction that they flow in. I really didn't focus that much on the details of the jewelry. I didn't focus on the major details because the idea that I had was that the sculpt was just supposed to be for display. So there was going to be a final render, and then I throw it into Photoshop and I edit it from there. So I didn't really focus on the giant big details of every single item, especially because it would have been extremely tedious to go in and sculpt every single bead individually. So I didn't focus on the details of the jewelry. What I did instead, I made an alpha that I used in the standard brush and the clay builder brush, and I just drew in the beads using the alpha and a drag rect enabled. So now when it comes to hair or things of that nature, I tend to have them as separate objects or separate subtools, just so that they don't affect the main body whilst I'm sculpting them or adding details to them, which I believe is what you should normally do. But it always depends on the sculpt that you're working on. If you have a character that it's like probably a bear, for example, you would want to sculpt in the hair onto the body. But if it can be separated, then you should probably separate it. Like I said before, I didn't want to focus too much on the jewelry because of the amount of details that go into jewelry for these kind of cultures. Like the headband, for example, most of the jewelry that they wear are made out of beads. And it would have been extremely tedious to try and make these beads by hand and draw them individually. So like I said before, like I said previously, I made a brush, a alpha, specifically for that, which it was just dots everywhere in order. Then I just drew over everything and I used the drag rect to get enough details. So as you can see here, I finally get to use the alpha that I've been talking about. Even though I didn't want to focus too much on the beads, the jewelry, I did know that without the beads, the headbands would feel a little too flat. They would just feel like leather wraps or cloths just around the head. And after all of that, we finally completed this sculpt. I really hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you found the way that I do certain things really interesting and informative, please like and subscribe and hit that notification button. It really helps the channel, and I will be posting a lot more very soon. So I will see you in the next one.